The morning air carried that peculiar weight that comes just before dawn, when darkness hasn't quite surrendered, but light is already threatening the edges of the world. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter stood at his observation post, a reinforced concrete structure buried into the coastal bluff overlooking what the French called the Pointe de la Mort, called the Calvados coast, his breath forming small clouds in the cold June air. The dampness penetrated everything here, settling into uniforms, into bones, into the very concrete that was supposed to protect them. He'd been awake since well before 5, as was his habit, preferring to witness the transition from night to day rather than be caught unprepared by it. At 32 years old, he was neither young nor old by the standards of this war, but he felt ancient in ways that had nothing to do with years. The English Channel stretched before him, a vast expanse of grey water that had looked the same every morning for months now. The same rolling swells, the same distant horizon where sea became sky without any clear line of demarcation, the same emptiness that had defined his posting since the division had been moved here from the Eastern Front. That front, that other war in the East, had been a different kind of hell entirely. He'd seen things there that still visited him in the hours before dawn, memories of frozen landscapes and desperate battles that made this coastal assignment feel almost like a reprieve. Almost. Because waiting carried its own kind of torture, the constant anticipation of violence that never came, until you almost wished for it just to break the monotony of dread. His artillery battery, 4 solid guns positioned in carefully constructed casements spread across the high ground, had been his responsibility for 8 months now. They were good weapons, well maintained, and his crews knew their work. The men under his command were a mixture, as all German units had become by this stage of the war. There were veterans like himself, men who'd survived the meat grinder of the Eastern Front and been rotated west to what was supposed to be a quieter sector. There were the very young ones, boys really, 17 and 18 years old, with smooth faces and enthusiastic energy that masked their complete lack of experience. And there were the older reservists, men in their 40s who'd been dragged back into uniform as the manpower situation grew increasingly desperate. Together, they formed something that could be called a fighting unit, though it bore little resemblance to the confident, aggressive forces that had swept across Europe in the early years. The 352nd Infantry Division, to which his artillery regiment was attached, had a reputation as one of the better formations stationed along the Atlantic coast. That distinction, Richter had come to understand, was relative. They were better equipped and better trained than some of the static defensive divisions composed of elderly men and recovering wounded, but they were not the elite troops of 1940. Those men were mostly dead now, buried in the snow of Russia or the sand of North Africa. What remained was a Wehrmacht stretched thin, trying to defend an enormous coastline with insufficient forces against an enemy whose resources seemed to grow more formidable with each passing month. The fortifications themselves, the famous Atlantic Wall that propaganda had trumpeted as an impregnable barrier, were far less impressive up close than they appeared in the newsreels. Yes, there were concrete bunkers, gun positions, and obstacles. The beaches below were studded with mines and barriers designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. But there were also gaps, incomplete sections, positions that existed on maps but not in reality. The distances were too vast, the resources too limited. Richter had walked sections of the coast and seen how a determined attacker could find ways through, around, or over defences that looked solid from a distance but proved porous under scrutiny. Field Marshal Rommel had arrived months earlier with orders to strengthen the coastal defences, and the man had been a whirlwind of activity. Richter had grudging respect for him. Unlike some of the staff officers who issued orders from comfortable headquarters far from the front, Rommel actually came to the positions, inspected them personally, and understood the practical realities of defensive warfare. He'd ordered millions of additional mines laid, had the men construct elaborate obstacles on the tidal flats, and had driven home a simple truth that Richter already understood, but that many in the high command seemed to ignore. The invasion, when it came, had to be stopped on the beaches themselves. in the first hours, the first day at most. If the Allies established a foothold, if they got their forces ashore and consolidated, then Germany's ability to respond was severely compromised. The reason was air power, or rather Germany's almost complete lack of it in the West. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, had been bled white over years of attrition. The pilots who remained were either inexperienced boys or exhausted veterans flying aircraft that were increasingly obsolete against the masses of American and British fighters and bombers that roamed the skies with near impunity. Any German unit trying to move in daylight would be spotted and attacked from the air. Reinforcements would have to travel at night in small groups, taking far longer to reach the battle than any operational plan required. Rommel understood this. He understood that the first day would decide everything, that once the Allies were ashore with their own air cover and their inexhaustible supplies, the outcome would become a mathematical certainty rather than a military question. But even Rommel's energy and insight couldn't overcome the fundamental problems. There weren't enough troops, weren't enough mines, weren't enough guns, and more critically, there was a strategic blindness at the highest levels of command that no amount of field preparation could correct. The German intelligence apparatus, which had performed brilliantly in the early war years, had been completely deceived about where the main Allied assault would fall. Every analysis, every intelligence estimate, every probability calculation pointed to the Pas-de-Calais as the inevitable landing site. It made perfect strategic sense. The Pas-de-Calais offered the shortest crossing of the Channel, the most direct route into Germany itself, and the best port facilities for the massive logistics operation an invasion would require. So the bulk of Germany's defensive strength in France, the 15th Army with its better equipped divisions and stronger fortifications, sat waiting at the Pas-de-Calais. The forces in Normandy, including Richter's own division, were seen as covering a possible secondary landing, a diversion perhaps, but not the main event. What none of them knew, what the intelligence officers and the staff planners and the field marshals couldn't see, was that they'd been systematically deceived by an Allied operation of such scope and sophistication that it had essentially won the battle before the first shot was fired. The fake army groups in England, the false radio traffic, the double agents feeding carefully crafted lies, all of it had worked perfectly. The Germans were looking the wrong way, and by the time they realized their mistake, it would be far too late to matter. The previous day, June 5th, had brought a storm. Heavy weather had rolled in from the Atlantic, bringing wind and rain and rough seas that made any naval operation impossible. The German Meteorological Service, using data from weather stations and U-boats scattered across the Atlantic, had confidently predicted that conditions would remain unsuitable for days. This forecast had filtered up through the chain of command and created a false sense of security. If the weather made an invasion impossible, then there was no need for the heightened state of alert that had worn down the defenders for weeks. Officers were given leave. Rommel himself had departed France to return to Germany, where he planned to celebrate his wife's birthday and then travel onward to meet with the Führer to request more resources for the defence. The top leadership of the defensive forces were scattered, confident that they had time, that the weather was their ally. Richter hadn't shared that confidence, but then he was a junior officer whose opinions on meteorology or grand strategy mattered to no one. He'd maintained his watch, kept his men at their posts, and waited with the patience of a man who'd learned that warfare was mostly waiting punctuated by brief moments of absolute chaos. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the air clear and cold and the seas still choppy but not impossible. Standing in his observation post as the clock moved past 5 in the morning, he was doing what he'd done every morning for months, scanning the horizon through his binoculars, looking for something that probably wouldn't come today, or tomorrow, or perhaps ever. The binoculars were excellent German optics, Zeiss glass that brought distant objects into sharp focus, even in the dim pre-dawn light. He'd developed a routine, a systematic sweep from left to right, checking different sectors of the horizon, looking for anything unusual. Ships were occasionally visible, fishing boats sometimes, or British patrol vessels in the distance. But this morning, as his gaze swept eastward along the horizon line, he saw something that made him stop, lower the binoculars, blink hard, and raise them again. There was a dark smudge on the horizon. Not a cloud, not a weather front, but something solid. Something that shouldn't be there. His first thought was that perhaps it was a trick of the light, the dawn playing games with shadows and reflections. But as he focused the binoculars more carefully, adjusting the eyepieces, the smudge resolved into shapes. Ships. Multiple ships. He swept the glasses to the left and saw more. To the right, the same. His pulse, which had been beating at the slow, steady rhythm of a routine watch, began to accelerate. He continued scanning, his hands starting to shake slightly, making the image jump and blur. Everywhere he looked, in every direction across the seaward horizon, there were ships. Not a patrol, not a convoy, but an armada. The scale of what he was seeing simply didn't fit into any category his military training had prepared him for. There were capital ships, the unmistakable profiles of battleships and cruisers with their massive gun turrets. There were destroyers, dozens of them, sleek and purposeful. And behind them, around them, in front of them, there was a mass of smaller vessels that seemed to extend as far as he could see in the gradually improving light. For several long seconds, Richter's mind simply refused to process what his eyes were reporting. It was too much, too enormous, too impossible. The rational part of his brain, the part trained in military analysis and threat assessment, tried to count, to categorize, to quantify. But the numbers made no sense. He'd seen invasion fleets before, had read the intelligence estimates of what the Allies might be capable of assembling. The highest estimates had suggested perhaps 3,000 vessels total for an invasion force, and that had seemed like an almost impossible number. What he was looking at made 3,000 seem laughably insufficient. The horizon wasn't a line between sea and sky anymore. It was a wall of steel. The individual ships were beginning to resolve into clearer detail as the sun crept higher. He could make out the different classes of warships, could see the distinctive silhouettes of British and American designs that he'd memorized from recognition manuals. There were the heavy battleships, massive vessels that displaced tens of thousands of tons and carried guns that could throw shells weighing as much as a small automobile. There were the cruisers, smaller but still formidable. The destroyers moved between them in complex patterns, their screws churning white water as they maintained an anti-submarine screen. And then there were the landing craft. That's what the mass of smaller vessels had to be. He could see them now, hundreds and hundreds of them, arranged in waves and formations that suggested a plan of almost incomprehensible complexity. There were large landing ships that looked like they could carry tanks and heavy equipment. There were smaller landing craft designed for troops. There were strange vessels he couldn't immediately identify, specialized ships whose purpose he could only guess at. The entire floating city seemed to be moving with terrible purpose toward the coast, toward his position, toward the beaches that his guns were supposed to defend. His breath came faster now, his chest tight with a rising panic that he fought to control. He was a professional soldier, a veteran, not some green recruit who'd never seen combat. But what he was seeing transcended any combat experience he'd accumulated. This wasn't a battle in any conventional sense. This was something else entirely, something that felt more like a natural disaster than a military operation. It was a tsunami of steel and men, and it was coming directly toward him. The field telephone was mounted on the concrete wall of the observation post. He grabbed it with a hand that he noticed was trembling, cranked the handle to signal the exchange, and waited for someone to answer. The voice that came through was sleepy, irritated at being disturbed. "This is Observation Post 4, Richter identified himself, his voice tight. "I have a visual on the channel. There are ships. A lot of ships." The duty officer on the other end sounded dismissive, clearly not fully awake or interested. "We've had some reports of ships, Oberleutnant. There may be a small raid or patrol activity. Maintain your watch and report any developments." Richter felt frustration surge through him, cutting through the fear. The man on the other end of the line was clearly not understanding what he was trying to communicate. "No, you need to listen to me," he said, his voice rising. "This isn't a patrol, this isn't a raid. The entire English Channel is covered with ships, from horizon to horizon, thousands of them. This is the invasion." There was a pause on the line, and when the duty officer spoke again, his tone had shifted to something that mixed skepticism with a trace of concern. "Oberleutnant Richter, are you certain of what you're seeing?" The weather conditions were not favourable. Our meteorological service indicated that an invasion would not be possible for several more days at minimum. "Your meteorological service is wrong," Richter snapped. "I don't care what the weather reports say. I'm looking at the largest fleet I've ever seen with my own eyes right now. You need to sound the alert immediately." The duty officer, clearly out of his depth and unsure how to process this information, told him to stand by and disconnected. Richter slammed the handset back onto its cradle, cursing under his breath. He grabbed the binoculars again and looked out at the sea. The fleet was closer now, and in the improving light he could see even more detail. There were flags flying from mastheads, signal lamps blinking messages between ships, and the water was churned into white foam by what must have been thousands of propellers. He tried another line, this one directly to regimental headquarters, hoping to reach someone with more authority and perhaps more sense. The officer who answered was his immediate superior, a major he'd served under for months. "Richter here," he said, fighting to keep his voice level and professional. "Sir, I'm reporting that the invasion fleet is in the Channel. The scale is beyond anything we anticipated. I estimate at least 10,000 ships." He knew he was probably overestimating, his brain struggling to quantify something so vast, but it felt closer to the truth than any conservative estimate would be. The major's voice carried doubt. 10,000 ships. "Richter, are you certain you're not misidentifying something? A heavy fog bank, perhaps? Or are you certain you're not misidentifying something? A heavy fog bank, perhaps? Or a merchant convoy that looks larger than it is?" The Weather Office assured us that conditions would prevent any major naval movements for days. "Sir, with all respect to the Weather Office, they are wrong," Richter said, his voice hard. "The weather is clear enough for me to see the end of the German Reich sitting in the English Channel. The fleet is here, it's real, and we need to engage it immediately while we still have the chance." That last statement seemed to cut through the major's skepticism. There was a long pause, then the sound of the major speaking to someone else in the headquarters, his voice muffled. When he came back on the line, he sounded more decisive. "Hold your position, Richter. I'm sending runners to confirm your sighting with other observation posts. If this is accurate, we'll issue the alert. Stand by for orders." The line went dead. Richter wanted to scream at them that there wasn't time for runners and confirmations, that by the time they verified what he was telling them, those ships would be launching their landing craft and the battle would already be lost. But he was a junior officer, and the military hierarchy didn't bend to accommodate panic, even justified panic. He turned to his men, who'd been roused by his urgent phone calls and were now gathering around the observation post, staring out at the sea. Their faces showed the same progression of emotions he'd experienced: disbelief, shock, fear, and finally a kind of grim acceptance. One of the gunners, a veteran sergeant who'd fought in Poland and France in the early years, just kept shaking his head slowly. "Mein Gott," he whispered. "Mein Gott." The younger soldiers looked to Richter for guidance, for orders, for something that would make sense of what they were seeing. He gave them what he could. Purpose. "Get to the guns," he ordered, his voice cutting through their shock. "Break out the heavy shells from the magazines. Start calculating firing solutions for maximum range. We're going to need every round we have." The men scattered to their positions, training and discipline overriding their fear. The battery's 4 guns were positioned to cover the approaches to the beach, with overlapping fields of fire that provided mutual support. They'd drilled on these positions for months, had calculated ranges to every conceivable target area, had practiced loading and firing until they could do it in their sleep. Now all that training would finally matter, though Richter suspected it wouldn't matter nearly enough. He watched as the ammunition handlers, working in teams, began bringing up the heavy armor-piercing shells from the underground magazines. Each shell weighed nearly 100 pounds and required 2 men to maneuver it into position. The gun crews checked their equipment one final time, the loaders standing ready, the gunners peering through their sights at the distant fleet. The rangefinders called out numbers in steady voices, maintaining their professional composure even as they calculated distances to targets that seemed impossible to miss. Through his binoculars, Richter could now see that the landing craft were beginning to organize themselves into assault waves. The larger ships had slowed their advance and were taking up positions that he recognized as bombardment stations. They were going to shell the coast before sending in their troops, a standard tactic but one that would be devastating given the number of guns they could bring to bear. He tried to count the battleships and cruisers within visual range and gave up after reaching 20. Each of those ships carried multiple gun turrets, and each turret held guns that could fire shells much larger than anything his battery possessed. The entire German defensive plan had been based on certain assumptions. One was that they would have advance warning of an invasion, time to move reinforcements into position, time to prepare. Another was that the Luftwaffe would contest the skies, making it dangerous for Allied ships to approach the coast. A third was that German armour would be able to counterattack quickly, throwing the invaders back into the sea before they could establish a foothold. As Richter looked at the sky, which was beginning to fill with Allied aircraft, and at the sea, which had become a solid mass of enemy vessels, he realized that every one of those assumptions had been wrong. Where was the Luftwaffe? He scanned the sky desperately, looking for the distinctive silhouettes of German fighters. There was nothing. Only Allied planes, flying in formations so large they looked like migrating birds. Fighters providing cover, bombers heading inland to strike at German positions, transport aircraft that must have been dropping paratroopers during the night. The sky belonged to the enemy completely and totally. Any German plane that tried to challenge them would be swarmed and destroyed within minutes. And where were the panzers, the armoured divisions that were supposed to be Germany's ace in the hole, the mobile reserve that could crush any landing before it gained momentum? Richter knew there were panzer divisions stationed in France, but they were spread out, holding positions across the entire country. The nearest significant armoured formation was the 21st Panzer Division, and even they were positioned inland based on the assumption that the invasion would come at Calais. They would need orders to move, orders that would have to come from the highest levels of command. And those commanders were scattered, Rommel in Germany, others asleep or unaware of what was happening. Even if the orders came immediately, even if the panzers started moving within the hour, they would have to travel along roads and through countryside that would be under constant air attack. Every bridge they needed to cross would be a potential death trap, every stretch of open road a killing zone. The Allies had spent months preparing for this moment, their air forces methodically destroying the French transportation network, hitting rail yards and bridges and roads. They'd planned for the German counterattack and had taken steps to ensure it would be slow, costly, and ultimately ineffective. The field telephone rang, making him jump. He grabbed it. "This is Observation Post 4. "Richter," the major's voice came through, now carrying a note of controlled urgency that suggested the sighting had been confirmed by others. "We have reports from all coastal positions. Multiple fleets sighted across a wide front. The alert is being sounded. You are authorized to engage enemy vessels at your discretion. Do not wait for further orders. Engage at will. Finally." Richter felt a grim satisfaction mixed with his fear. He turned to his gun crews, who were already in position, waiting for his command. "Batteries," he called out, his voice carrying across the position. "Engage at will. Fire." The first gun fired almost immediately, the massive cannon recoiling with a violence that made the ground shake. The shell screamed out toward the sea, visible as a dark streak against the morning sky. Richter tracked it through his binoculars, watching as it covered the miles between his position and the fleet in seconds. There was a massive plume of water as it impacted, a miss but close to one of the destroyers. The second gun fired, then the third and fourth in rapid succession. His crews were good, working with the smooth efficiency of constant drilling. The shells began falling among the fleet, great fountains of water erupting between the ships. Richter called out corrections based on what he could see, his gunners adjusting their aim fractionally. Then he saw it, a direct hit on a destroyer that had moved ahead of the main formation. The shell struck amidships, and even at this distance he could see the flash of the explosion, the black smoke that billowed up immediately. The ship shuddered, began to list. A cheer went up from his men, a moment of savage triumph in what was rapidly becoming clear was a completely hopeless situation. The destroyer was the USS Corey, though Richter had no way of knowing the name. All he knew was that his guns had scored a hit, had damaged or possibly sunk an enemy warship. It was a tiny victory, barely a pinprick against the vast armada, but it proved that they weren't helpless, that they could fight back. His men redoubled their efforts, loading and firing as fast as they could manage. More shells screamed toward the fleet. Some missed wildly, disappearing into the empty sea. Others struck close enough to the ships to send columns of water cascading across their decks, and a few found their marks, hitting hulls and superstructures with the heavy crump of detonating explosive. But for every shell his battery fired, for every hit they scored, 100 enemy ships sailed past untouched. The fleet wasn't scattering or pulling back. The gap left by the damaged destroyer was simply filled by another ship moving up from behind. The machine was so vast, so overbuilt with redundancy, that individual losses meant nothing. It was like trying to stop a river by throwing rocks into it. You might disturb the flow slightly, might create a small eddy or splash, but the river would keep coming, keep advancing, keep drowning everything in its path. And then came the reply from the fleet. Richter had known it was coming, had braced himself for it, but the reality still took his breath away. He saw the flashes first, bright spots of light from the big ships anchored offshore. The battleships and cruisers had turned their massive guns toward the coast, toward his position and the other German strongpoints, and opened fire. There was a delay of several seconds, long enough for him to think that perhaps they'd missed, that the shells had gone wide. Then the world began to explode. The first shells landed short, hitting the base of the bluff in massive detonations that sent geysers of earth and rock into the air. Then they adjusted, the gunners on those ships correcting their aim with the same professional efficiency that Richter's own men had shown. The shells began walking up the slope toward his position. Each one was like a meteor strike, a cataclysmic explosion that left a crater dozens of feet across. The sound was beyond anything he'd experienced, even on the Eastern Front. It was a physical force that pressed against his eardrums, that made his chest vibrate with each impact. The concrete walls of the observation post shook. Dust and fragments of rock rained down from the ceiling. The air outside became a fog of dirt and smoke. One of his gun positions took a direct hit, a shell that must have weighed well over 1,000 pounds slamming directly into the concrete casement. The explosion was enormous, a flash of orange fire and black smoke that completely engulfed the position. When the smoke began to clear, the gun was gone, simply erased along with the men who'd been operating it. All that remained was a smoking crater and twisted metal. Richter grabbed the phone, trying to contact his remaining gun positions, but the line was dead. The bombardment had cut the communications cables. He was isolated, blind to what was happening at his other positions. Through the observation slit, through the smoke and dust that filled the air, he tried to see what was happening. The fleet was closer now, close enough that he could make out individual details on the ships. The landing craft were loaded and moving toward the shore in long lines that seemed to extend forever. The sky was black with aircraft, an umbrella of fighters and bombers that circled endlessly, looking for targets. Another massive explosion shook the observation post. this one close enough that chunks of concrete broke off from the ceiling and crashed to the floor. The structure was never designed to withstand this kind of sustained bombardment. The walls were thick, yes, but they'd been built to resist smaller caliber shells and bomb fragments, not the heavy naval guns that were pounding them now. Richter knew that it was only a matter of time before a shell found the perfect angle, penetrated the structure, and killed everyone inside. He looked around at the men in the observation post with him. The radio operator was hunched over his equipment, trying desperately to establish contact with anyone. The telephone operator had given up on his deadlines and was simply sitting against the wall, staring at nothing. Two runners, young boys really, looked terrified but were trying to hide it behind expressions of studied indifference. They were all going to die here, Richter thought. Not immediately, perhaps, but soon. Whether from a direct shell hit or from being overrun when the Allied troops reached this position, or from simply being ground to pieces by the overwhelming firepower being directed against them. He thought about his family back in Germany, his wife and his young son, whom he hadn't seen in over a year. He thought about the Germany he'd grown up in, before all this madness, before the war and the ideology and the transformation of his country into something he barely recognized. He thought about all the propaganda he'd been fed, all the promises of inevitable victory, of superior will and fighting spirit overcoming any material disadvantage. It had all been lies, comfortable lies that men told themselves to avoid confronting the mathematical reality of their situation. The truth was that Germany had been doomed from the moment it declared war on the United States. The moment that vast industrial machine across the Atlantic had been turned toward military production, the outcome had been determined. It was just a matter of time and arithmetic. The numbers didn't lie. Germany could produce a certain number of tanks, aircraft, and ships per year. The Americans alone, not even counting the British and Canadians and Russians, could produce 5 times that number, 10 times, 20 times. The exact figure didn't matter because it was always the same answer: not enough. Every Tiger tank that rolled off the production line in Germany was a masterpiece of engineering, a technological marvel that could destroy any Allied tank in single combat. But for every Tiger, the Americans were producing 30 Sherman tanks. The Shermans weren't as good, weren't as heavily armoured or as powerfully armed, but they didn't need to be. You couldn't win a war by building small numbers of perfect weapons. You won a war by building vast numbers of adequate weapons and then overwhelming your enemy with sheer mass. The bombardment continued without pause, a rolling thunder that didn't diminish or slow. Through gaps in the smoke, Richter could see the first landing craft approaching the beach. The German machine gun positions in the pillboxes along the waterline opened fire, their tracers lacing across the water. He saw men falling as the ramps dropped, saw the surf turning red. The 352nd Division was fighting, doing exactly what it had been trained to do, making the invaders pay for every yard of sand. And they were succeeding in that limited goal. The beach was becoming a slaughter pen, bodies piling up in the shallow water. But it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Because behind those first landing craft were more, and behind those were more still. The Allies weren't trying to win through tactical brilliance or superior fighting skill. They were simply going to keep sending men ashore until the Germans ran out of bullets, ran out of men, ran out of time. It was the same industrial equation playing out on a tactical level. The defenders had a fixed amount of ammunition, a fixed number of troops. The attackers had an unlimited supply, or near enough that the difference didn't matter. And then Richter saw something that made him understand just how thoroughly the Germans had been outplanned. Allied destroyers, those sleek, fast ships that should have been staying safely offshore, were driving directly toward the beach. They were coming in so close that they risked grounding themselves on sandbars, close enough that he could see individual sailors on their decks. And then they opened fire, their guns pointed not at each other in some naval duel, but directly at the German fortifications on the beach. They were providing close support fire for their troops, systematically destroying the pillboxes and gun positions that were causing so many casualties. It was suicidal and brilliant. Any damage the destroyers took from running aground or from German fire was considered acceptable compared to the need to protect their troops on the beach. And it worked. Richter watched through his binoculars as German strongpoints that had been holding out were systematically eliminated, smashed by direct fire from ships sitting barely 1,000 yards offshore. The machine guns fell silent one by one, their crews killed or forced to abandon their positions. At the same time, strange new vehicles began appearing on the beach. Trucks that seemed to drive directly out of the water, amphibious vehicles that transitioned from sea to land without stopping. Tanks that crawled ashore, some equipped with huge rotating drums that thrashed the sand ahead of them, detonating mines in great chains of explosions. Others had enormous flamethrowers or special bridge-laying equipment. The British had built specialised armoured vehicles for every conceivable obstacle, an entire menagerie of mechanical solutions to the problems posed by a defended beach. The Germans had nothing comparable, had never even conceived of such things. The beachhead was being established despite the casualties, despite the German resistance. The first wave of troops had been devastated, but the second wave was landing, and the third was right behind them. Allied engineers were clearing obstacles, blowing gaps in the beach barriers, creating lanes through which more men and equipment could flow. Tanks were moving inland, their guns adding to the bombardment of German positions. The battle for the beach was still savage, still costing lives on both sides, but the outcome was becoming clear. Richter's observation post took another hit, this one even closer. The entire structure shuddered, and a section of the concrete wall cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. He could smell cordite and burnt propellant, could taste dust on his tongue. His ears were ringing so badly that the explosions outside had become a muffled pounding rather than discrete detonations. One of his remaining gun positions, he could see through a gap in the smoke, was still firing, still sending shells toward the endless fleet. The crew were heroes or madmen or both, standing their ground even as the world collapsed around them. Then that position too was silenced, a massive explosion that sent a mushroom cloud of black smoke boiling into the sky. 3 of his 4 guns were gone now, and the 4th he couldn't contact. His battery had been effectively destroyed. All those months of preparation, all that training, all the carefully calculated firing plans and ammunition stockpiles had been erased in less than an hour. He and the handful of men left alive in the observation post were irrelevant now. Tiny pieces of debris caught in a storm that was orders of magnitude larger than anything they could affect. The landing beaches were filling with men and vehicles. Richter could see the mass of Allied troops moving inland, pushing past the shattered German defences. The strongpoints that remained were being bypassed, isolated, cut off. The textbook response would have been an immediate counterattack by armour, fresh troops hitting the disorganised invaders before they could dig in. But where were the panzers? Still waiting for orders, still trying to navigate roads that were under constant air attack, still hours or days away from being able to influence the battle. The Luftwaffe was absent, had been absent all morning. The few German aircraft that had tried to contest the airspace had been swatted down immediately by swarms of Allied fighters. The sky belonged to the enemy, absolutely and completely. Richter watched as wave after wave of Allied bombers flew overhead, heading inland to hit German positions, supply dumps, communication centres. Each bomber carried tons of explosives, and there were hundreds of them, thousands across the entire front. The amount of destructive power being delivered was staggering, incomprehensible. He did a rough calculation in his head, trying to quantify what he was seeing. The intelligence estimates he'd read suggested the Allies might field around 3,000 aircraft for an invasion. What he was seeing in the sky suggested that estimate was absurdly low. There must have been 10,000 planes, 15,000, numbers that seemed impossible, but that couldn't be denied when you looked up and saw the sky black with them. The Luftwaffe, on its best day, might have scraped together a few hundred aircraft across all of France. They were outnumbered 50 to 1, 100 to 1. The numbers told the story. In 1944, the United States alone would produce nearly 100,000 aircraft. Germany, by comparison, would produce around 40,000, and many of those would be obsolete models or trainers rather than frontline fighters. The Americans could afford to lose 10 planes for every one they shot down and still come out ahead. They could absorb casualties that would have been catastrophic for Germany and barely notice the dent in their production capacity. It was the same story with tanks. Richter knew that the German Tiger and Panther tanks were superior to anything the Allies fielded. A Tiger could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman couldn't even effectively return fire. But there were so few Tigers. In the entire war, Germany would produce only about 1,500 of them. The Americans, meanwhile, were stamping out Sherman tanks at a rate of several thousand per month. By the time the war ended, they would have produced nearly 50,000 Shermans. The British would add tens of thousands more of their own designs. The Soviets were producing T-34s by the tens of thousands as well. The German strategic position wasn't just difficult, it was mathematically impossible. Even if every Tiger tank destroyed 10 Allied tanks before being knocked out, the Allies could accept those losses and still have overwhelming numerical superiority. The same calculation applied to aircraft, to trucks, to artillery pieces, to every piece of military equipment. Germany's industrial capacity couldn't match even one of its enemies, let alone all of them combined. And it wasn't just the production numbers, it was the logistics, the ability to move all that equipment and maintain it in the field. The American logistics network was a thing of terrible beauty. They'd built specialized ships to carry tanks and trucks across the Atlantic. They'd stockpiled millions of tons of supplies in England, everything from ammunition to fuel to food to spare parts. They had truck factories churning out vehicles at a rate of hundreds per day, creating the transportation network needed to keep their armies supplied. They had oil from Texas and wheat from Kansas and steel from Pittsburgh, all flowing in an endless stream to feed the military machine. Germany, by contrast, was running out of everything. Oil reserves were critically low, dependent on the synthetic fuel plants that were themselves running short of coal. Food supplies were strained, with the agricultural workforce depleted by military service. The transportation network was crumbling under the weight of Allied bombing, with rail lines cut and bridges destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Every resource was being stretched to the breaking point and beyond. The big man in Berlin, the Austrian corporal who'd styled himself as the leader of a 1,000-year empire, had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He'd assumed that ideological fervour and superior German will could overcome material disadvantages. He'd believed his own propaganda about racial superiority and the weakness of democratic societies. He'd thought that quick victories and bold gambits could compensate for a lack of industrial depth. Every one of those assumptions had been wrong, and millions of people were paying the price for his delusions. Richter had stopped being a true believer years ago. Somewhere in the frozen wastes of Russia, watching men freeze to death in positions that couldn't be held, seeing supply lines stretch past the breaking point, he'd lost faith in the promises. The Eastern Front had been a revelation, a glimpse of what total war looked like when both sides were committed to mutual annihilation. He'd learned that ideology couldn't stop a bullet, that willpower couldn't substitute for logistics, that declarations of inevitable victory meant nothing when you were outgunned and outnumbered. And now, watching the Allied armada disgorge its endless stream of men and material onto the beaches of Normandy, he saw the same equation playing out on an even more massive scale. This wasn't a battle. It was an industrial process. The Allies had built a machine for winning wars, a system that could absorb losses, adapt to setbacks, and keep producing more of everything faster than it could be destroyed. Against that machine, individual courage and tactical skill were irrelevant. You couldn't win by being brave. You couldn't win by being smart. You couldn't win at all because the math didn't work out. The bombardment of his position had slackened slightly, the naval guns shifting their attention to other targets inland. Richter took advantage of the relative quiet to try to assess the situation. The observation post was still mostly intact, though the cracks in the walls had widened and more concrete was crumbling with each nearby impact. His men were still alive, though they looked shell-shocked and exhausted. He had no communications with higher command, no way to receive or send orders. His artillery battery was destroyed. His ability to influence the battle was effectively zero. The rational thing to do would be to surrender, to wait for Allied troops to overrun this position and then give up. He'd be a prisoner, would sit out the rest of the war in some camp somewhere, but he'd survive. Many German soldiers would make that choice in the hours and days to come, would decide that dying for a lost cause was pointless. But Richter found he couldn't quite bring himself to do it. Not yet. Not while his men were still looking to him for orders, still trusting him to make the right decisions. So they stayed at their position, watching the invasion unfold below them. The beaches were solidly held by Allied forces now, with men and equipment streaming ashore in organized lines. The German defenders who remained were isolated pockets, cut off and surrounded, fighting simply because they didn't know what else to do. The casualty figures for the 352nd Division would later show that they'd lost over 1,000 men on that first day, a huge percentage of their combat strength. They'd fought well, had made the Allies pay dearly for Omaha Beach, but it hadn't mattered, because winning a single battle against overwhelming odds is sometimes possible. Winning a war against those same odds is not. Germany had been losing this war since the moment it started, had been on a countdown to defeat that only the leadership was too deluded or too committed to admit. Every soldier like Richter who'd seen the reality on the ground had known it for years. They'd known it when the Americans entered the war and the industrial balance shifted catastrophically against Germany. They'd known it when the Eastern Front stabilized and the Soviets began their grinding advance westward. They'd known it every time they looked up and saw enemy aircraft where German planes should have been. The rest of June 6th would see the Allies establish 5 separate beachheads along the Normandy coast. The Germans would fight hard at all of them, would make the invaders bleed for every position, but they couldn't stop the tide. By the end of the day, 150,000 Allied soldiers would be ashore, along with thousands of vehicles. The beachheads would be linked, expanded, turned into a continuous front. More troops would flow in on June 7th, and the day after that, and the day after that. The machine had started, and it wouldn't stop. The fighting in Normandy would continue for another 2 months, a brutal grind through the hedgerows and small villages of the French countryside. The Germans would fight skillfully, would mount counterattacks and establish defensive lines, would make the Allies pay for every mile. But the outcome was never in doubt. Every German soldier killed was irreplaceable. Every tank destroyed was gone forever. The production lines back in Germany couldn't keep up with the losses, couldn't match the industrial output of the nations arrayed against them. The Allies could lose 3 men for every German casualty and still win through sheer attrition. And they were willing to pay that price because they could afford it. For Richter personally, the war would continue for months more. He'd be pulled back from the coast when what remained of his unit finally retreated, would be reassigned to another defensive line further inland. He'd fight through the summer and into the fall, watching the slow collapse of the German position in France. Eventually, he'd be surrounded in the Falaise pocket, where tens of thousands of German soldiers would be trapped and destroyed by Allied air power. He'd be one of the lucky ones who made it out, who escaped the encirclement and retreated toward Germany. But the man who crossed back into German territory in late 1944 would be different from the man who'd stood watch on the Normandy coast. The last traces of faith in the cause would be gone, burned away by the reality of unwinnable mathematics. The propaganda had spoken of wonder weapons that would turn the tide, of jets and rockets and supertanks that would give Germany the edge it needed. Some of those weapons would materialize. The Me-262 jet fighter was genuinely revolutionary, faster than any Allied plane. The V-2 rocket brought terror to London. But they were too few, too late, and too resource-intensive. For every jet fighter produced, the Allies were fielding 100 conventional fighters. The rockets were psychological weapons that had no real military impact. The supertanks broke down more often than they ran. The wonder weapons were a fantasy, a desperate hope that technology could somehow overcome the fundamental imbalance in industrial capacity. By the spring of 1945, Germany would be fighting inside its own borders, defending cities and towns against enemies coming from both east and west. The end would come in May, with the country in ruins, the big man in Berlin dead by his own hand in a bunker, and millions of soldiers like Richter facing the reality that they'd fought and suffered for nothing. The war would finally be over, and Germany would have lost in exactly the way that anyone looking at the production numbers in 1941 could have predicted. Ideology, willpower, and tactical skill had proven insufficient against the simple mathematics of industrial warfare. But on the morning of June 6, 1944, all of that was still in the future. In the moment, standing in his damaged observation post on the Normandy coast, Klaus Richter was simply a soldier watching an invasion fleet that filled the sea from horizon to horizon. He'd known immediately what it meant, had understood with perfect clarity that Germany's chance of winning the war had just evaporated. The Atlantic Wall was broken, the beaches would fall, the Allies were in France to stay. Everything after would be just a matter of time and tonnage, a slow-motion collapse that was inevitable from the moment those first landing craft touched sand. He'd seen the end of the war in that moment, seen it with a clarity that most of his countrymen wouldn't achieve for another year. It was the morning everything changed, the morning the mathematics of defeat became unavoidable reality, the morning a German officer looked through his binoculars at the power of the industrial age arrayed against him and understood that there was no way to fight that with courage or skill alone. It was over. It had always been over. June 6th just made it visible for those willing to see.